Okay, guys, we'll get going there. Just get 2 more people in there. Okay, so look, good evening to you all. My name is Fitzgerald. I'm the Kerry GA Games Development Administrator for Munster Technological University Kerry campus. I'm delighted to welcome you all on here again tonight to our 4th webinar of Season 2 of our Kerry Coaching and Games webinar series. Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by former Kerry senior football captain Fionn Fitzgerald, who will speak to you about returning to play. Fionn started playing Gaelic football with his hometown club Dr. Cross of Killarney at the age of 5 and is still starring for their senior team to this day. He has played with Kerry at all age groups and was a member of the Kerry senior panel from 2012 to 2018. In 2014, Fionn, along with teammate Cian O'Leary, captained Kerry to win the All-Ireland. Fionn, who worked in exercise science at the Munster Technological University Kerry, is also a strength and conditioning coach, and it was in this capacity that he was a member of the Kerry Under-20 management team for 2020. Before I pass you over to Fionn, can I remind you all to please have your cameras and microphones off at all times. We will have a Q&A after the presentation, and this will be hosted by Kerry GA GDA for West Kerry, Tomas Murray-Hurtig. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. Thank you and enjoy the presentation, and I'll pass you over to Fionn now.
Thanks, Eamon, and welcome everybody. First of all, just check if everyone can hear me, Eamon. We good?
Yeah, we can hear you.
And you can see it all fine, yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. First of all, I was told to remind you that I'm talking a little bit about return to play from the point of view of maybe being a player and coaching. I'm not here as a COVID a COVID guy or anything to do with COVID protocols or anything like that. Okay, so just in case anyone thinks that I am coming on with a list of protocols, I won't be. So basically, I'm going to come at it from the angle of playing, I suppose, in a big way, from being a player, and then secondly, from my side of work, and basically, I suppose, what would be common practice or best practice for coaches. I've kept it quite basic because I presume there's a mix of coaches who are looking at kind of adults or adult teams, and then there's a mix who are looking at coaching of underage. So they're similar and they're different. Okay, and we'll talk about that as we go. The principles and the messages are going to be quite similar, really. Though that's the main or the most important part of this. If you have any questions at all, hold them to the end, and I'll answer them all as best I can. And I suppose the big message really is that I have put this together in a basic enough, hopefully relatively easy to understand kind of an idea. If anyone wants me to layer it up at any stage, there's no problem at all. I wanted to try and get this across to as many as possible. So basically, I just had a little bit of the format is basically what are you preparing for in so far as going back, how are you going to do it, and how will you get there safely, coaching or working with the youth or the adult, and then maybe some of the practical suggestions and how we can get that working. Okay, so that's the format, and I'll get rocking. So basically, I suppose the most important part for me anyway, and this is crystallized in the last couple of days with the good weather. I presume a lot of you have probably had barbecues already this evening. I think everyone, coaches and players, particularly players, are going to be like spring lambs basically. They're mad to get back on the field, literally mad to play, to meet people, just to get back into the rhythm of being involved in a kind of team setting and all that. So that's what I miss most anyway. I'm not sure what you all feel, but I presume there's similar enough feelings from coaches in this as well. So the first point, I suppose, would be everyone's going to be excited at the start. Everyone's going to be full of great ideas and all that. But I think that it's important that as coaches, that you get an understanding of what the players want and need. Okay, so it's not like the players get to decide everything they need to or want to do. However, I think an understanding of where the players are coming from. Players have missed the football aspect or the hurling aspect, mostly I think over the last game I played was September anyway. So I think it's important to know that that's the part that they're most looking forward to, not necessarily the laps or all the cones that you plan to put out. So just keeping that in mind first of all. The second thing I suppose is this idea of feast or famine. We've had a famine for the last 8 months, we'll say, whatever you could say, the last 15 or 16 months in some ways, but it could come thick and fast in some ways then. So it's understanding a little bit about how we return players properly and safely, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so look, I'm not going to get too heavy into the actual science of such here. Okay, we'll try and keep it quite simple. But when you're talking about players, performance-wise, there's 4 main areas normally. Your technical, your tactical, your physical, and your psychological or your psychosocial. So in very simple terms, if I was to ask you all right now, what areas would you want to concentrate on most, or what would be most important for you right now? A lot of you would say, oh, probably all aspects. But I would say the area that most of you will be most concerned when you go back is probably the physical. Okay, which is important, and we'll talk about how important that is in a second. But I think it's important to remember what I said in the first slide, returning to play. So playing involves the ball. It involves understanding what the game is actually about. So sometimes maybe what you have planned or you plan to do may not necessarily be reflected very well in the actual game itself. Okay, so hopefully it might get you thinking a little bit about what you're going to do or what you're planning on doing for the next for when restart occurs. Okay, so that's my first kind of point. I would say the physical aspect is probably what a lot of people will be concerned with. So look, I'm not going to get into this, is as sciencey as it's going to get now, but what are you preparing for? So we'll talk about the technical, tactical aspects and all soon of playing, but physically, on average, okay, I'm kind of doctoring this a small bit for club level, but there is a little bit of research. So what does a player cover at club level? Roughly about 8 kilometers per game. Some of this is obviously modified from senior into county as well. Of that, you're probably going about maybe 1.5 kilometers on average at what we consider to be high speed, so above 17 kilometers an hour. Don't worry too much about the figures here, but just to give you a rough idea, kind of number of sprints, you're talking about maybe 40 sprints per game, and then top speed of about 30 kilometers an hour. They're all averages to an extent, so you're obviously looking at maybe players positionally then in full forward line, full back line being differently, obviously, to the likes of the half forward line. Okay, so that would probably dictate the different demands there. However, it's probably no harm to get an idea of the ballpark demands of what goes on for something like, say, Gaelic football. Okay, I'm using that as an example here. The youth on the other end, I wouldn't worry about any of that, and I wouldn't necessarily get tied up on any of those figures there anyway, because unless you have like something like GPS to measure that, it's not really going to be that relevant to you. But on the flip side, you have your youth. Okay, so I suppose the most important aspect of preparing a youth when they go back is they're just gone back to school. Okay, they've obviously missed a huge amount from a point of view of social setting and so on. and they're basically meant to get back and play. Okay, they're just looking for a bit of fun. Adults are as well. We're all kids at the moment, but particularly for kids, it's important that they're just getting back to doing to playing the game. An interesting year, I suppose. I'm probably a little bit biased, and this is because I've done in the middle of a PhD, and I'm looking at early and late maturing players, but there will be varying levels of maturity. So if you haven't seen your players in, for example, let's say guts of 8 months, maybe 6 months, whatever it is, you're going to see a huge amount of changes here. So you could see, for example, it's a little bit of an exaggeration sometimes, but you have your big guy here and your small guy. They're obviously the same age. You're going to have a lot of mismatches and a lot of changes in physical sizes and so on over the last maybe 12 months or so, and you probably haven't been able to kind of almost see them on a weekly basis or a more regular basis. So that's something you need to figure out or keep a handle on when you go back. And then the other aspect, I suppose, is a lot of sports are going to come together. So you're kind of almost going back to the feast or famine scenario again. So we'll talk about kids more as we go along, but the first point is you can't measure them up as adults. You can't be doing the same, and just because they've been off for a certain length of time, you can't plan what you're doing in a similar way with adults. The emphasis has to be on fun for them, and basically you're keeping an eye on where they're at. A lot of changes happen for kids around the particularly the pubertal years, so around kind of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, around them ages. So you need to keep an eye on all the different sports that are going on as well. Okay, so let's get moving on what actually is important here. So in very simple terms, what are you preparing for, or what have players missed most in the last, let's say 8 months, and I'm going to say nearly 12 months in some cases. So you're basically, a lot of players will have got into their 5Ks, they're gone out running, a lot of linear type of running, and maybe a lot of unstructured running, which has probably been very good and quite liberating and as good for the mind as it was for everything else. However, for most players, unless they're following a very organized kind of succinct program, the kind of parts they're missing probably are accelerating, decelerating. So in other words, unless you're specifically going out to train them, most people go running and they cover a certain distance, or they go out in a field and they do laps, or they do particular runs or whatever, but there wouldn't be a huge amount of accelerating, decelerating. Plus, unless you're with someone like family, or you've broken the rules or whatever, there probably isn't going to be a huge amount of opportunity to play games in the last while, or there shouldn't have been anyway. Running fast, okay, so anyone here who still plays or who's involved, or even their kids are involved, when's the last time you think they actually ran as fast as they could? So there's a difference between running and even maybe sprinting versus actually running as fast as you can. So imagine someone said, this is a race, or I'm going to track how fast you can run. So we'll talk about that in a second, but that's really, really important. So those first 2 points are important. So not getting heavy on science, they're just really, really important. They haven't done it. And they're the kind of things, think about like driving a car fast. They're the parts that put most pressure on the body. So it's what makes good players. It separates them from turning, from getting away from players, evading, all that kind of stuff. But it puts a lot of pressure on the body too. And most of us wouldn't have had much experience in that in the last 7 or 8 months. So then imagine all that kind of stuff. So change direction, then all of that with a ball, then without a ball. Okay. Then you're adding in all the skills of the game, catching, dummying, falling, all the different pieces. You're adding in contact, tackling. Okay. Then you're building this in with team play. So what I suppose where I'm getting at here is, right, you can make this as easy and as simple as you want. Okay. But at a very basic level, the things that they've missed most over the last while are obviously being in a group setting, so the psychological aspect of that. The physical aspect, it's the decelerating, the accelerating, the running fast, the change in direction, okay? And then they've missed, I would imagine for most people, the majority of the ball type of stuff, the technical stuff, okay? So you've got to keep that in mind when you're putting together your session. So like for most people, you probably have some bit of an idea of what you want to do for the first couple of weeks. And then I know there's probably a little bit of waiting around to see how the government roll out the plans and all that, like, but the plan I suppose would be that once we start, we won't be going backwards from now. Okay. players don't want to be going back to running loads of laps, okay, and millions of cones. Even though, like, don't get me wrong, I use cones all the time, and they're really useful and important as well. But the main emphasis has to be here on getting some of the bits and pieces I spoke about there in order, okay, and that includes all your game-based stuff, which we'll talk about soon, okay. So just a small little bit of background. A lot of you who have an interest in coaching and maybe who followed any other little bits and pieces will have heard a little bit of this. So when COVID first hit last year, everyone was referring back to some research in 2011 when there was the NFL lockdown, and basically it was all around the idea that they were off for whatever it was, 11 or 12 weeks, and when they came back there was a huge spike in injuries. That's at professional level. So then something similar happened here last year, and there's obviously loads more studies coming out since, but the Bundesliga were kind of first to come back, and in very simple terms what they found was that there was over 3 times higher risk of injuries, of soft tissue injuries. So these are like your normal hamstring, groin injuries, calf, any of the typical kind of muscle strains, we'll call them, than before they were injured or pre-lockdown, okay? And this is the really important part to make. So this doesn't really matter whether it's younger or older, okay? This is aimed at an adult population, but I'll talk a little bit about kids and younger people as well. But most of this risk was at the very, very start. So just kind of, I suppose, fast forward to 6 weeks time. Maybe we were allowed back training in a month, and then a few weeks later, if there was games, it's the first game or two and almost the first part of training and all that at the start. That's when you're at your highest risk, okay? So 17% were either before the first game or the first game, and then after that, it literally went way down, okay? So as the first few weeks went on, the injuries decreased. So it probably might be very obvious to a lot of you, but I'll use a couple of simple examples and analogies soon that might make it even more easy to understand. In very simple terms, you're at your biggest risk when you go back at the start. You're starting from a lower base, okay? And this is the time to be careful with your players. So if you think it's the time to go back and we've missed out so much, let's catch up, let's do loads of stuff, like you'll have people's hamstrings up around their neck after 2 nights, and you'll have players dropping like flies. So that's as I said here, that they're professional teams with top sports science and medical background teams, and ultimately that's what happens. And they knew this was possibly going to happen, okay? Anyone who's involved in teams last year probably would have seen a lot of injuries as well. The common ones are obviously your hamstrings, groins, hips, knees, ankles, okay? And what are they caused mainly by? The answer is you got a training load. So in other words, how much training you're doing, or the intensity of your training, and the time between recovery and all. There's loads of aspects to training load, but basically what it means in simple terms is what you're actually doing, okay? The second part to look at, and this is me with a little bit of an interest in the youth athlete then, is younger players too are at the same kind of risk of injury basically, and they even have another little thing to play around with, or another consideration is a lot of them could now be going through puberty or on their way through puberty. So they're going through this big famous growth spurt, and you may see this in your own kids at home, or I don't know, other kids who'll be involved in teams and so on over the next while. They're at even a higher risk at that time. So not alone are they coming from maybe a lower base, but now they're playing around with all these hormonal changes in their bodies and muscles and ligaments and all the different kind of growing factors that go with that. Okay, so that's just maybe the other caveat to the youth player. Okay, so if you're getting this balance wrong, okay, at the start, then you're going to be in trouble. So I'll just use this simple analogy. Okay, it might look a little bit science here or confusing, but it's not. I'll explain it as simple as I can. So a guy called Tim Gabbett, Jason McGahan, who's obviously overall the athletic development in Kerry, he's done a bit of research with Tim, and he's been giving us a little bit of insight into some of his work at times, and he gives a very simple analogy of a lot of the kind of complex science. And what it is basically is he describes the idea of a player's fitness level coming back up in what we call now as pre-season, because that's what it is. Effectively, you're bringing your players back in now at pre-season. They've been off for a certain amount of time. You have the ceiling and the floor. Okay, so if your player is coming back in very, very poor condition, his fitness level is down here by the floor. Okay, so it's really, really low. So you're starting from a really, really low base. If you want to get him fit and you want to get him to a certain place, so you want to get him really, really fit, and you try and do this quickly, okay, that error basically, that's going to be considered a major error, because what you're doing is you're trying to almost make up this ground way, way too quickly. So he gives a very good kind of simple analogy of the idea of maybe drinking. So this is your beer, this is your vodka. So if you want to go out on a night and you want to get merry or you want to get drunk, for argument's sake, if you take it easy with pints of beer, it's going to take you an awful lot longer than it will if you start drinking vodka or you're drinking whiskey or something like that. So in other words, if you jump in at the deep end here with training, okay, and you go in really hard and heavy with someone where their base is quite low, then ultimately it's a recipe for disaster in relation to a lot of these injuries we spoke about. If you take the kind of, I won't say the very long-winded approach, but a little bit of a longer type of an approach, ultimately you're probably going to get them back safer and they'll be able to stay back, and you'll have when championship hits later on the season, probably we'll say August, September by the looks of it, your player will have gradually built up his load and he'll be an awful lot more healthy and be able to consistently go. Okay, so this is like lecturing online. I can't see any faces, but I hope that makes some little bit of sense. I can explain it more afterwards if you want. But this ceiling and floor idea, obviously, the bigger the difference, so the better the base of fitness for your players coming back, the easier it's going to be. So if you think of professional sport, they might only get 2 weeks off. So I know they mightn't be back for 6 weeks training, but they're told to take a week off, 2 weeks max, and they're going back to very little bit of training to keep their base level high. Because once your floor is close to your ceiling, it means you have way less ground to make up, which means that you've far less chance of having to almost push the red buttons to really get up to the higher level of fitness, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. If your players are what you think are very unfit, the wrong thing to do is to go hard and heavy early. Okay, and that's probably the most important point you're making today. You have to take the kind of more gradual approach to this. Otherwise, like you're looking at a lot of maybe muscle injuries as you go there. Okay, so a couple of guiding principles, like simple enough ones. I try to make them as easy as I can. Overload and progressions are ones we deal with students the whole time. What that means very simple is you need to overload the body simply. So this is the one we always use with students, whereby you start with a calf. Okay, you start carrying the calf to work or to school, and as you get bigger, as you get bigger as the calf gets bigger, because you have to carry more weight. Okay, and it's like increasing your weight or your reps that you're doing. Same goes for a run. So if you want to do 5K worth of running the first day, you might aim for 5.5 or 6K the second day. So rather than absolutely massive spikes, you're looking at gradual ones, which builds in with the progression idea as well. Okay, so that's important to note, that you do need to overload for the body to adapt and get better and stronger and faster and fitter and all that, but it has to be done in a kind of a safe way. If you take the last example of doing this really, really hard at the start or going at it in a very aggressive manner, you're probably looking at causing trouble here. There has to be variation, and that's an important point I'd make now for coaches going back. Like, don't just have, this is the way I'm going to do these types of runs and that's it, and we're going to play loads of the box game or something like that. Like your players, once again, we said, what are they missing? They're missing loads of technical skills. They're missing all of those football aspects, and then they're also missing the accelerating, decelerating, changing direction, reaction, all that type of stuff. So you need to give them loads of different stimuluses, training stimuluses. So like in the warm-up, you might try different things at different stages, like small-sided games, which you talk about soon, little games that you probably normally already do. Like, as I said, a box game, you might manipulate the conditions. So the smaller field, a bigger field, you might have different rules that make them do certain things. There's loads of ways of varying it. In your skills, you might focus on certain skills certain days. Other days, you might have a different focus. You can't do everything at once, but variation is important, because I'd say for most players, unless they were abroad or they took time out of the sport or they were injured, they probably haven't had this length of time away from it. Okay, Specificity. Like, you're only going to have a couple of months anyway when you break it down. So there's no point in wasting loads of time on unspecific stuff. I would say for the last 4 or 5 months, most players have been doing very unspecific stuff anyway, which is fine, because in a way, for some players, they may be fresher if they're off doing their, as I said, their different types of runs, or they may have been doing circuit training at home and doing things they may normally have not had an opportunity to. Now it's an opportunity for you to be a little bit more specific to what does the demands of the game require, what do you actually need to be good at. So if you're a corner forward, or if you're a particular position or whatever, being a little bit more specific to your training. Okay. And the last one then is planning. So like, there's probably, out of all the rest of them, there can be, I would say there can definitely be, you can understand how someone may not understand all parts of organizing training, but planning is something that everyone can do quite easily. So the probably simplest way I would explain it is I would suggest working off a month plan when the green light is given. So even for the first month, that can be changed very, very easily. But basically, having a month plan will be really, really useful. So even within that, then it'd be your first day. So let's say you're 2 days the first week and you go back, and you can start to tinker your plan or change it a little bit. So these are going to be the main focus for the first 2 sessions. But after a month, this is hopefully where we'll be. And then you can change it from there. The reality of it is, youth sport is coming back, or youth Gaelic games coming back next week. And then I would say within the next month, you're probably going to have small group training for senior players. So that still leaves a good few months away from main championships. There will be probably county leagues or different things. I'm not 100% sure of the competition structure, but ultimately speaking, like, there should be plenty of time to build up the gears, as one would say. Okay, I'm going to move on with that. I don't necessarily. That's basically the guiding principle I would use when I'm working with injured players. Okay, and this was made up and adapted in Premier League football. A guy did a lot of his work with injured players, and what it is very simply is, at stage 1 with an injured player, you're keeping it very controlled, and at the end it's going to be very much chaotic or high chaos. So high chaos, playing football, normal game, going 100 miles an hour, and like no inhibitions. Whereas high control is something like starting with them at very low level running and slowly building up the pace, and that type of an idea. Even skill work would be, quite controlled. So that kind of an idea, I don't think we need to go to level 1 almost when we're going back playing. But if you have that kind of that, and you want to look at that a little bit more, the idea of the control chaos continuum. So starting more controlled, and then it gets more chaotic at the end. I think that's important for particularly some of the players come back from injury, or even older players, or players who need a little bit more kind of TLC or whatever. Okay. So in simple terms, what do I think are the most practical things to do? So basically, I would say plan training in 4-week blocks, as I said already. It's easy to scale up or down there. Using a stopwatch or reps, etc., is very useful here. Okay, so I know that might sound basic or simple, but like, some people start a session and all of a sudden it's an hour and a half or 2 hours later, and they just get carried away with the session. So if you have a plan and your warm-up is supposed to take 10 or 15 minutes, say 10 minutes, if it takes 11 or 12 minutes, whatever, but parts of sessions really start flowing into the other a lot of the time if it's not planned well, or else if you're not keeping a track on, say, time, or even if it's something like reps you're using. So I need to do a certain amount of reps of this game, or reps of drill, or whatever it is. Warming up. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time talking about that, because that's kind of quite obvious. The GA15 warm-up, which you'll get online, is probably a real simple one that most GA teams end up doing, where you start with a more basic, slow build-up, and then you make it more sport-specific at the end, shoot the ball, and you're doing all your mobility as you go, and so on. Okay, conditioning. Very simply, guys, I put in that photo of Kerry, because what I would say is everyone has their own favorite places in Kerry, or they like going around visiting. The same goes with conditioning. So I'm definitely not going to come on here and say, this is the type of training you need to do. Okay, I'll give you a couple of ideas that I think are important, and parts that are really important, but ultimately you may have your own ways as such of doing it. So it could be a combination of long interval runs, shuttle runs, mass runs, some of you may be familiar with. using game-based training. There's loads of examples. I know James spoke very well on games-based training a couple of weeks ago. The ideal scenario for me anyway, when you're going back, is players, we'll say a lot of players hopefully will have done some little bit of base work. Okay. If they haven't, their floor is going to be quite low, so you'll have to mind them. But for the majority, they have some little bit done. And the ideal scenario is that you're integrating fitness work with skills. Okay. Because they're missing out on the skills in a huge way, and they would have had. So that's important. I think that if you can at all times almost try and include the skills. This individualization, when I was putting this together, I was thinking, how do I explain this simply to someone? So as a coach, I would say you nearly need to figure out, you know your players hopefully reasonably well, thinking about the kind of almost highest and lowest common denominator. So in other words, what I mean by that is you're going to have like always your fittest guys of, like I could name the guys in our team that you'll have no worries for whatsoever. And then there'll be guys who'll be down the back or that would have been injury prone before, or they would have done very little. You nearly need to kind of figure that out. Okay, so think of the beer and vodka analogy already. Like some players are going to be, well able for you to push on the training at an early stage and maybe have kept in really good shape. Others won't have. Okay, so I think it's really important that doesn't take. You don't need to be a scientist to prescribe running differently. So, for example, if you're doing particular types of sessions, they may need to pop out a little bit. This is your first night back here tonight, Johnny. So ultimately, what you're going to do is you're going to do the warm up. You're going to do maybe parts of the speed work at 80%, and then you're going to do some of the skills based stuff with whatever, and we'll leave it at that. You have to build up gradually for different players. Otherwise, it's going to bite you in the arse somewhere. Monitoring, you don't need any fancy like monitoring tools or anything. I would say just talk to them, or even get a handle of if there's 4 or 5 players you can rely on very well. 1 or 2 maybe at the top, 1 or 2 in the middle, 1 or 2 down the bottom. How was that like as a session, or how are you feeling? How were you after the last night? Even during a session a little bit, so you get an idea quickly enough. Especially if you're experimenting or trying new things out. How hard is it out of 10? You could use the RP, which is how hard they think it is out of 10. Recovery is important, so you need to allow for adequate recovery at the start, particularly the first few weeks. Remember the stuff I said about the Bundesliga there. I think that it's important to note that as regards recovery at the beginning and giving a little bit extra there, and hoping that players take on, I suppose, an extra responsibility in relation to their own preparation, because that's important. I'll refer to the ready to play resources there in a second again. Right, so obviously we're all looking, just turn on the light here a second. We're all looking for a COVID vaccine at the moment, but on a slightly different note, sprinting is a kind of funny one. So I'll come back to the chicken and egg scenario here again. So I suppose a lot of people would be worried about sprinting a lot of the time. Okay. So in other words, basically what they would feel is sprinting, you're more likely to get injured when you sprint. And the answer is 100% you are. And if you don't sprint regularly, you're definitely more likely to get injured. So some of this study here from a guy called Shane Malone, he looked at the idea of basically, he did it in an inter-county team in Ireland, and looked at players who hit they're close to their high speed, so they're nearly at 100% regularly. They found the players who hit close to their 100% level, so they're close to their own top speed regularly, over time, they built up what you call a chronic load. So it's like almost building up a store of your body getting used to it, and as a result, it almost acted as a vaccine or an insulation. So they're less likely to get injured. Okay. The flip side of it is, if you're underexposed to sprinting, so if you don't sprint that often, and particularly now for guys who are coming back, it's so obvious now. They don't come back, they've done loads of 5Ks, they've done loads of distance runs, all that type of stuff, and then you're going into games or you go playing straight away, and all of a sudden sprint, hamstring gone. Okay, so this has to be done in a smart kind of progressive way. Like if you're building into speed stuff, the first session might be you're only building up to 75% at any stage. You're never going above that. Then the next day, 80, 85, and you build up towards top speed. But the ideal scenario is after a few weeks, in all your trainings, you're getting some opportunity, whether it's at the end of the warm-up or whether it's a kind of a race between one another, or it's in a race with a ball or something. Like you can put in different ways of doing this, but you do need to get your players running at what's close to their top speed, and that will make them faster, obviously. But secondly, it'll actually, funnily enough, insulate them from injury. So the chicken and egg scenarios, the less you sprint, the more likely you are to injure. And at the start, you are likely to get injured from sprinting, but the more you get used to it, the less likely you are. Hopefully, I hopefully explained that well enough. But that goes for everyone, but that's particularly based on adults and inter-county footballers, actually. Okay, so what do I think is realistic at the moment? Kids is a little bit different, but for seniors, I imagine it's going to be small group training at the start, like it was last year, non-contact, more than likely anyway. So that'll probably involve at the start. The easy ones for you to put in are like some form of linear types of runs, whether shuttle runs or mass runs or whatever type of sessions you prescribe. Some change of direction running, but my big advice really would be is trying, even if it's in smaller groups, try and get the ball in as much as possible. Try and bring the ball in some ways. Like they don't have to be making contact for you to bring the ball in. There's so many different ways. A couple of examples here that I've used myself over the last while. I'm going to just play a video here. Hopefully this video will work. So this is just examples of races. Okay. So you could say they are contact, but you could make them non-contact. You could make them a little bit away from one another. But this type of stuff is a great way of practicing speed, but a bit of fun as well. You could put the ball in front of them. You could drop a ball. Just be creative in how you do these kind of things. But that's the type of stuff I would look at as being a bit different than your basic go out there and run, whatever it is. I don't know, I'm going to have to mute this because it will be playing the background. Okay, nearly there now. So those kind of competitions, they're examples at maybe the first stage, that type of stuff. And then when you get back to full training, I would say probably a lot of people have gone mad in talking about small-sided games in the last, I suppose, couple of years, and there's been a good bit of research done in Gaelic on it. Basically, most of you have been doing small-sided games all your lives as coaches, like things like box games or different condition games where you people, I don't know, like a tackling drill almost maybe or so on. To an extent, they're all small-sided games, okay? Why are these useful, and why would I really encourage using a good bit of these at the start when you come back? Well, starting slowly using them in a kind of like dipping in a little bit with them, and then you can make them longer and more challenging as you go. So think of the beer and vodka analogy. Once again, you want to start slowly and build them in, but if they're well designed, what they basically are doing is they're matching the demands of the game. So you can do loads of running, you can do loads of isolated drills, but they're still not really, that's not putting it together in football terms, for example, or hurling or whatever. Okay, it's very easy to just manipulate the pitch size, the rules, to get different things out of it. So you can get different outputs. You might want more ball contacts for players. You may use less amount of players so that they have to cover more ground. And there might be conditions in there for tackling, support play, which encourages them to run more, which also gets them used to running fast. So there's loads of different advantages here. If you're a little bit creative, you don't need to be any like very, very experienced coach to start to get going on this. So many important considerations though, and this is the kind of, not the negative, but it's something, the caveat to it. There will be loads of twisting and turning in these. So these are better than any twisting or turning drills, because that's what happens in a game. But like, you can't just go in and do loads of these at the start. So the first few weeks, from having just done a lot of 5Ks, as I said, and that straight line type of running, to doing loads of this type of stuff, players are going to get groin injuries and hamstring injuries and all these type of ones because their body isn't ready for it. So you can't think of the beer and the vodka analogy once again, or the roof and the ceiling. You can't just go in straight away and expect that these can go on, full tilt and keep them going for ages. That'd be my biggest worry, that people would keep these small, so there's great intensity there, this is going well. Let it roll or flow for ages. No, hold at the start and you can slowly build it up as you go. Use a stopwatch. A lot of people, when they're doing small-sided games, when it gets good, they forget about the stopwatch. If it's a 3-minute game, they're doing 3-minute games. Pull it after 3 minutes. Don't let it go for 5, because then it's a different. The quality is diminished, and you're going away from what you really want to get out of it. Okay, So there's loads of resources. I'll talk about some of them if you want ideas or anything on anything to do with small-sided games. But you could use that as a major part of your sessions at the start, and then you make them into bigger side games, and you're into full-size games and all that type of stuff. Okay.
Sorry, Fionn. Could you go back to the video again? I don't think it played there actually.
Okay, no matter.
Sorry.
Right. Let me see. Do you know what I'll do? I'll play it at the end because I'm nearly there. I'll play it. Okay. Sorry about that. Last little bit, so it's just basically resources. Jason from Kerry has sent on, I know, some COVID return to play guidelines and a couple of ideas. I think to every club or club secretary. That was from the last lockdown, as far as I know, or early in the year. The GA Be Ready, and he's available at any stage as well because I was speaking to him. So if anyone wants to get in touch there, the GA Be Ready to Play program is a brilliant resource that was created a couple of months ago there, and Des Ryan is leading that. And what it basically is you can look at either your youth, so your child, your adult, or advanced. So it's catering for all age groups and all different levels. And there is gym programs, like home-based gym programs. There's home-based athletic development, so field type of stuff, and loads of different ideas. So for coaches who are a little bit unsure of ideas for example, warm-ups, or for any aspect of the kind of performance part, the physical aspect, and there's a load of good resources there. So if you go on to, I've left the link there, type in Be Ready to Play, you'll get it on the GA website straight away, and you just set up an account and you click on which one you want to be. You can be either a coach or a player. I think you can even register as both of them. So I definitely recommend that for a lot of good resources. There's a couple of other people, like from a youth perspective, online you get GA game-based coaching from on Twitter. Kieran Deely puts up a good bit of stuff. Barry Milan, there's a lot of guys like that. I can give you loads of examples or ideas if you want any more there, no problem. So that's it. Now I'm done. I'd say basically, what's the main message? The main message is that it's returning to play, the play and the ball part being the most important aspect. Okay, that's the part that we've all missed. I missed anyway personally. That's what I'm most looking forward to going back as a player. But it's also the part that will be most effective to me, hopefully, when games do resume, is the ball aspect. Okay, so like combining physical and the ball will definitely be probably the model that I'd encourage anyway. But as I said, there's loads of different ways of going at it. Planning, I'd look at it right now, even plan the first month. Okay, and you don't need to be planning in incredible detail, but roughly what's the main outcome, or what are you looking for at the end of a month, and then work it back to what do we do for the first week, and then what does a session look like. So if you plan it, it just works way easier. If you don't plan it, unless you're really experienced, it's going to be hard. And think of the beer versus vodka analogy, or the ceiling, the flooring one again. You need to start gradually. Like what really important stuff is going to be done in the next month or two. So you've got to start gradually, build up their tolerance. Think of the Bundesliga kind of research there, and the idea that the injuries were really high for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then they really settled down once they got, once you got a couple of games under their belt. Okay, talk to the players, that they'll give you as much feedback as any as regards how it's going and where you're going with it as well. Okay, so like I said, I tried to make it as basic as I can. Hopefully I didn't lose you. It can be a little bit hard when you're online at times. I'm sick of the online lectures too, because you're dealing with blank screen. So if there's any questions at any stage after this, just get in touch, and hopefully I can be of some bit of help anyway. And I'm just going to play that video, see if it works. So that video that I was on about. Okay, can you see it now, Eamon?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so this was just an example of, like, even for the non-contact scenario at the start. So some examples of, like fun competitions or drills. So you could do your speed stuff. You could do little challenges. You could do change of direction ones. You could have the ball in there, pop a ball over the head. There's just loads of ways of doing this. Okay, but okay, So hopefully may have got a couple of ideas there. That's me, Eamon, anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Fionn. That was excellent. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone got something from tonight's presentation. I suppose the big thing I took out of it, I suppose, was the risk of injury. I suppose being higher this time. I suppose before versus pre-COVID. I suppose load management is very important. I suppose. I suppose asking them how they feel and how the body's reacting. I suppose to being back training. I suppose it'd be a lot of knocks and bruises. kind of. I suppose. So being back in a team environment for the first time in a while, I suppose, and I suppose also the most important one that I still I suppose encourage the players to have fun and enjoy the sessions, and I suppose that goes for the coaches as well. We're all mad for road, like we had over 100 coaches on tonight, which is fantastic on the finest evening of the year. So just enjoy being back in the field, so we have a few questions, I suppose, Fionn. We just had a few, I suppose, that came in there before. I think there's just one that's coming to the chat there. I'll just read it out, Darcy O'Connell from Renard here. Would it be possible to forward the presentation to the clubs so we could share coaches who couldn't make it tonight? I suppose it has been recorded, Fionn, so it'll be available, I suppose, on our Kerry YouTube channel anyhow. So after, it'll be in the next few days, that'll be on, I suppose. So I suppose the questions, I suppose, what would you focus on for the first month, Fionn? There was 3 questions that came in before the presentation, I suppose.
Well, if it's going to be small group training, or whatever way they do it like that, I probably would almost try and put similar fitness level players together first of all. That'd be the obvious thing. And I would focus on building up a little bit slower with the players who are starting from a lower base, obviously. That I'd give them a little bit extra TLC at the start. I'm talking about players who maybe regularly get injured or are a little bit older or just coming from a poorer base. And I would probably really get them focusing on a little bit of aerobic conditioning at the start, and then they're going to have to get exposed to running a little bit faster. So you're slowly building a little bit of building up the gears basically as regards speed. So let's say over the course of a month that their initial session might start out at, I don't know, between everything from warm up to different conditioning drills to a little bit of ball. It might be a 5K session to, by the end, it might be 7K session, for example. So you're starting with 4K to 7. That type of an idea. The intensity of what they're doing at then is changing a little bit. I don't know, is it possible for me to probably go into, I could spend half an hour talking about what I'd actually do with them really in a way. But I don't know, does that give some little bit of an insight? The focuses for me will be on ball, conditioning with the ball, and focusing on getting up towards top speed again. So like the turning, the twisting, the running, but making it a little bit fun. Like, so they could be mirroring each other or mimicking each other, anything like that. You have to be a little bit creative. That's the reality with this. With this social distancing or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah. And how many sessions per week would you recommend, kind of, I suppose, initially?
I would say 2 at the very start, depending on where they're coming from, and then obviously 3. Like, I don't think there's a major advantage in doing 4, for example, to be straight out about it. Like, that's
I suppose get a feel for how the group is, I suppose, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I suppose another thing would be that for the majority, things like gyms are closed as well, so I didn't really get a chance to go into that too much. But for anyone who kind of is interested in an understanding of it, like any kind of form of resistance training that incorporates any like injury prevention stuff, so any of your like single leg exercises and all that type of stuff in your warm up would be brilliant, because a lot of fellas probably maybe aren't getting that exposure, and when they're coming from a bit of a lower base anyway, that would definitely be useful as well.
Yeah. I suppose just a final question, I suppose. What are your thoughts? And I suppose some teams have been training via Zoom, I suppose, since January. Like, what are your thoughts, I suppose? And I suppose probably no championship probably until the next September, I suppose. What are your thoughts on that? Like,
my gut instinct would be delete Zoom for about 3 weeks anyway, at least, until like I would give a mental break anyway. I think everyone is just fatigued from it, and I think the output is actually quite poor now. I'll be honest, at all levels, from people who work on Zoom to people who are involved in sport on Zoom. There's a fatigue or saturation part onto it. So I'd break away from it for a few weeks. I reckon teams will be back in a few weeks, and there'll be nothing majorly important to play for a few weeks after that anyway when you do get back. So I think there's loads of time. I'd be taking a chill on that for a while anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
I definitely give them ideas and prescribe, like, for people. It's not like you just cut ties and do nothing. Like, you'd have maybe examples of sessions for them all, and hopefully a lot of them will do it in their own time, or you could help them in some way. But ultimately, I definitely would. I wouldn't go near Zoom anyway. But that's me.
Yeah. No, that's about it. I suppose there was no other questions came in the chat, Fionn. I suppose just look again. I suppose on behalf of Kerry Coaching Games, I'd like to thank you for giving us your time tonight and delivering. I'm sure everyone got something out of it, Fionn. It was very beneficial. And I suppose the big thing, I suppose, as well, the feedback from the Bundesliga last year. Look, to be mindful of that. Next week, I suppose, youth coaches, I suppose, less is more. I suppose definitely. Initially, I suppose. Best of luck, I suppose, with the rest of the PhD, I suppose. I suppose again, I'd like to thank, I suppose, the coaches. Like, this is our 4th webinar, and the numbers have been, super. Like, as I said, like, tonight's the finest night of the year, like, and we've over 100 coaches logged in. That's a testament to ye, I suppose, wanting to learn, and and that bodes well for the future of the club football and the clubs in Kerry, like that. You're willing to learn, I suppose. I suppose going back to Darcy's question, tonight's webinar has been recorded and will be available on the Kerry Coaching and Kerry Coaching Games YouTube channel, I suppose, in the next few days. I suppose again, I suppose, look, I suppose we're finished with our webinar series. We're all, as Fionn said, we're all mad to get back in the field, well, with their teams and their clubs for the year ahead. And Gurmila Mahaga for tuning in for the last 2 weeks. Thanks, Fionn.
Thanks, Tommy. There's a big difference between Bundesliga and Gallus, I reckon.
Absolutely.
Right. Chat to you soon.
Take it easy, Fionn.
Okay, thanks, everyone.